No both and when we are living in these different opposite polarized spheres, and we talk about that pattern, the polarizing pattern, as the either or pattern of trench warfare, because basically instead of having conversations where we can come together across differences of opinion, learn from each other, respect each other, and find places where we can get to a more creative solution, what we're doing is we're digging trenches so that we're hiding away from the other side. We can't see the other side, we can't hear the other side, and we're just firing out at them, and we don't even know who they are. We've dehumanized the other side of the they. And so the big issues that we're facing in the world, whether it's climate change or racial injustice or whatever else it may be, that are just these huge issues that we're facing, we can't solve them because all we're doing is shooting each other around them. And I think that's a big problem.
So how do we change the questions that change our viewpoint?
Yeah, it starts with changing the questions for ourselves. I'll just take a step back. So you and I met when we were having conversations at the Victoria Forum around climate change. That's a big one. And one of the things that's really hard around climate change is it feels so impending and so consequential. What do we do in the conversations with people who have a different point of view about climate change? Now, are we willing to talk to them? Are we willing to have a conversation with people who are different than us and hear what they have to say and work through that together? And it starts there, which just starts with, can I assume that there's a both and in that realm? Can I assume that there's a both and to be clear, I don't think that, for example, in the climate change realm, the both and is climate accepting, climate denying. I don't think it's that extreme. I think what it is in the political realm is that most people, when it comes to climate action, and this, the Pew research will show this, most people believe that we need to take climate action, but just have differences of opinion about degree and type. So like 80-something% of people aren't denying climate change. They believe there's action that needs to be taken, but the conversation and the way that conversation is happening and the nature of the conversation and the stress that they're placing is different. What if we could move forward in a way where 83% of the people are all on board with one another to push forward on some kind of action? We would get so much further than we are today, where we're having these fights between like 10% on one side and 10% on the other side. And I think it starts with asking ourselves, are we willing to be in dialogue, to go back to discourse, in dialogue, in conversation, and listen to people that we don't agree with? I always feel a little bit hesitant to say this because I think this sounds super idealistic. And yet, if you go back in history again and again, people will say that great conflicts have to start, at home. They have to start at the kitchen table. They have to start in the town hall, where you're building relationships across people that are different with different points of view in service of then building that out and expanding that out. And I think that's true. I think we need to be having conversations where we listen to people who, listening doesn't mean agreeing. It means respecting that there is another point of view where people have differences of points of view and we can listen to them.
Can you talk about the three conditions that make paradoxes more salient?
Yeah, so that's what we were saying earlier. What we argue is that paradoxes are the foundational nature of our world. And this argument is not ours. This argument goes back to the Buddha. It goes back to Confucius. It goes back to Heraclitus 2,500 years ago, yeah. Right? And so if our world stands on the nature of competing ideas in relationship with each other, sometimes the relationship between love and hate, good and evil, or the relationship between today and tomorrow, or expansion and contraction, or whatever else it might be, doing for the other and doing for the self. Sometimes those relationships can be very much, focused in different realms, and we don't have to bring them together. And what we would say is that there's conditions under which they come together, and we have to grapple with that relationship, that paradox, right? So it may be that in our early 20s, we don't really have to grapple with work and life because we can just spend all our time working, and we might not have a partner, or we might not have kids, and we might not, our parents might not need taken care of. And the kinds of multiple demands on our life aren't quite as salient. And so the work-life tension doesn't feel quite as salient in our 20s as it might in our 40s, when our parents need more of our support and our kids need more of our support and our partner needs more of our support. And the demands on our life are, from others is just much more present and poignant. So that's why we say, look, there's these three conditions that make these tensions more poignant. One is change, the pace of change. One is scarcity, the experience of having fewer resources that need to be allocated, like our time. And one is plurality, the multiplicity of voices, and having those voices need to be heard.
Lots to think about.
Don, I'll just respond to that, which is that Marianne and I will often say to each other that the more you know, there's the paradox of knowledge. Yeah. The more you know you don't know. And this concept of paradox, like all of a sudden we'll feel like, yes, I've got it. And then it just feels slippery and slips away. And it just makes our head hurt sometimes in the best of times. So indeed, it is it's a concept that we think is powerful of a way to live and a way to interact with people. And it's hard to get our heads around sometimes.
Can you talk to performing, belonging, organizing, and learning?
Yeah. So one of the things that we have noted is the big idea here is that paradoxes are everywhere. They're everywhere. And so we delineate the different realms where we experience paradox, not because we think it's important for people to say this is a performing paradox, but because we think it's important for people to note these different paradoxes that happen all over the place. So performing paradoxes are the tensions that happen with competing goals and demands and outcomes. And so tensions between managing for, doing good in the world and managing for financial success in the world, whether that's personal or organizational or goal or different pressures of outcomes. Learning paradoxes are the paradoxes of time and the tensions of who we are now and who we want to be. This tension, for example, of, what does it mean to be authentic to who I am while simultaneously growing into something else that I'm trying to be? And how can I grow? And do I feel authentic while I grow? Well, the more that I grow, the more that who I am is authentic. But the more that I'm authentic, the more it enables me to grow. So how do I deal with that tension? Organizing paradoxes are the paradoxes that emerge in how we do things, whether at an individual level or a collective level. And, how do we engage in a group that we engage both competitively and collaboratively? I'm trying to make myself sort of be effective. And the more effective I am in relation to the group, but the more effective I am is about how much I give to and collaborate with the group. So those are organizing paradoxes. And belonging paradoxes tend to be the most abstract, but they're paradoxes of our identities and who we are, and paradoxes of how we address who we are compared to how others are. And, here you can think of the classic Ubuntu statement, I am who I am because you are who you are, that I am who I am through you. Well, am I distinct and different from you, or am I part of you? Is, sort of a classic belonging paradox. Am I the individual, or am I part of the collective? And so those are just different realms in which it comes up about who and how and what and when. And so there's all kinds of different tensions that emerge.
I hate to jump around, but I'm curious, was this a hard book to write? You've been at it for a while. I'm curious what the reaction was like.
It's been an amazing process. About 20 years ago, when we started this work, we very much were received from academics a lot of skepticism. And we're told, don't publish around this because you can't get it published. And one of the things that we did over those 20 years was not only continue to reject that and publish these ideas, we also built community with other scholars who were interested in publishing these ideas. And so we now have a broader scholarly community. What's been interesting is now 20 years later, we have, and this is where I was starting to say earlier, we've seen an increase in the language that people are using about needing to think about paradox and the both and. And they use, at first we were told, don't use the word paradox with the real world people, the practitioners outside of the Ivy League. Don't use the word paradox because they won't understand it and it's too complicated. Well, we see other people using the word paradox all the time now because it really does convey this idea of living in opposites that feels irrational and illogical. So places like PricewaterhouseCoopers talks about the 6 paradoxes that leaders need to lead in. And our colleagues over in Oxford, Michael Smets and Tim Morris, have some work with Heinrich and Struggles, the executive search firm, where they say that the greatest challenge facing leaders is paradox. So it's not us using the language. It's what we've seen is that there's been this increase in the label of both and paradox showing up as a real issue that we need to face. And I think that it's a real issue we need to face because the challenges that we face in the world are just so much more complex. And we're seeing the competing demands embedded within them. The need to sort of focus on what we're doing today in the short term to impact the long term, and yet being able to look out to the long term in order to be able to enforce or to inspire what we do in the short term. And we're seeing the ways in which those things interact, and we're seeing the ways that we have to engage in individual action at the small wins to be able to have an impact on the big picture systemic change. But we also need systemic change to reinforce and enable individual action. We're seeing that relationship, and those are paradoxical relationships. So I think because we're seeing it when it came to publishing the book, we no longer had to sell people. I think of the work that we've done as a two-step process. The first step is helping people see how poignantly or how pervasively we think of challenges as an either or, and move to both and. And the second step being, okay, we think that there's a both and there's paradox here, and we should apply both and thinking, but how do we do that? And we wrote the book, our academic research was very much about helping people move beyond just either or, contingency-based, linear, conclusive decision-making, into more holistic, as you were saying, integrative thinking, and into both and. But at this stage, we wrote the book because people are using both and they're hungry for how do we do this? And we feel really privileged to be amongst a whole community of colleagues that have some insights about how to do it. There are some people who will say, oh, haven't we been around that block before? Don't we know it? Isn't duh. And there's some people that will say both. There's few people who will say both and that's way too complex and that's not useful. But for the most part, people are saying, yeah, this is a really useful topic and we need to know how to do it better.
Yeah, I think the book is incredibly timely, especially with world events being what they are. I'm curious what some of the stories you can share that some of the feedback you've had.
Yeah, it's everything from the very personal to the global, and so one of the powerful experiences that I love to, that I've been really moved by is my co-author Marianne is a dean of her business school, and she shared the book with the administration at the business school, with the provost and with the president. And she recently was at a retreat with the senior leadership of the school, not the business school, but of the university. And they were talking about, a classic tension that comes up in universities. Are we focusing on excellence or are we focusing on access, and the extent to which access for a multitude of people might feel like it's a trade-off with excellence of quality? Well, immediately the provost looked over and said, well, maybe this is a both and. And what she found was not just in that tension, but in the conversation that ensued, it opened up so much possibility about how they thought about what they did and who their stakeholders were and how they could be more creative about it in that tension and others. And, I think part of it is that it not just opened up new strategic possibilities, it invited people into conversation who typically tended to take opposing perspectives and would would sort of rub each other the wrong way. It would diminish that friction and invite everybody into the conversation so that they could come to better places together. That's the kind of powerful stories that we're hoping to hear more of around some of these big issues that we face in the world. How can we come together instead of being in constant debate about how do we address climate change? How can we come together to a better place around that? I'll give you another example. I was talking about some of the things that my community was doing on a very local level to address issues of waste and issues of the landfill. And so what my community and what I've been really involved in doing is this movement around eco bricks, which is basically stuffing our plastic trash into plastic bottles, because so much trash is like plastic bags and, packaging. And that's what ends up in the landfill. And so much of our trash is bottles, and that's what ends up in the landfill. And somebody realized, outside of the United States in a developing world realized that if you can stuff trash into bottles and pack it in hard enough, then you can create these bricks that end up, you can use them as bricks to build things with in places that don't have as much building material. Well, we started doing that in the United States, in our community here in Philadelphia. And it seems like it's such a small action to really address the tons and tons and tons of waste that we have in the landfill. And yet it shifts the consciousness of people to be more thoughtful about climate change and climate action broadly. And this has become an international movement where people are doing this around the world. And, I don't think it's a decision of whether we need to be creating massive innovation to scrape the bottom of our oceans from all of the trash that we have thrown into it, or we need to be putting our individual household trash into a bottle. We need to be doing both, and they're going to reinforce each other.
Yeah, I've got to tell you that this is probably one of the most important books I've read, and it just ties into so much of my work about conversations or how to have